Well, this is my last Sunday as a single man. So, if any of you young ladies would like to declare your love for me, this is the last week you can do so. Actually, Jen told me not to tell that joke. Anyway, we are glad you're here this morning. I do have a confession to make, though. I lived in Georgia. I was born in Oklahoma. I moved there when I was 5, and I stayed there until I was 28. So I wasn't a math major, but if I do that correctly, that's 23 years. And yet, I do not consider myself to be particularly Southern. As far as I know, I don't really have an accent. I avoid using the word y'all. I don't like NASCAR. I don't really understand it. They just drive around in circles. I don't wear Confederate flag t-shirts like a lot of the guys I went to high school did. I understand those who do, but not really my thing. And perhaps worst of all, I don't really care for grits. Grits are a delicacy in the South. And even though I don't care for them, I've lived there long enough to know a few things. For instance, grits are made with cornmeal, which is then put in a mixture of water, milk, butter, salt, and pepper. And sometimes cheese is added as well. And so you mix all that together, and they heat it to boiling, and you simmer it for, Wikipedia says 20 to 40 minutes, for the cornmeal to absorb all of the liquid and stuff, and it turns into a nice creamy texture. That's what I've learned. I still don't care for it. When it gets cold, it turns into a milky jello-like thing that just stays on your tray. It's not good. But grits are a delicacy in the South. And it occurred to me that there may be only one way I would eat grits. And that is if someone made them truly from scratch. Now, it is possible to make instant grits, but true Southerners don't use the box, they make them from scratch. But what if someone really made it from scratch? And I mean, I'm talking really literal here. What if they grew their own corn, picked it off the stalk, and ground it up into cornmeal themselves? What if they raised the cow, got the milk from the cow, separated the cream? What if they churned their own butter and went down to the salt mines to get their own salt, dug a well in their yard to get their own water? If someone truly made it from scratch, I bet those would be the best grits in the world. I might actually eat those. It occurred to me that most things are better when they're done from scratch. Really from scratch. And as we get into this week of the story, talking about our patriarch Abraham, it occurs to me that God started from scratch. Because he knew that the best things in the world come from scratch. You see, God could have picked a nation from that time. He could have picked Egypt. Egypt was powerful, had a lot of people. Why did he pick them? There were other empires in Mesopotamia that were doing well at the time. He could have started with a whole group of people, but he didn't. He started with one man, a man by the name of Abraham. And God started with that one person, and God claimed him for himself. And from him began the process of creating a nation. God started from scratch. And so in the Bible, we get the story of this man named Abraham. And Abraham was an interesting guy. His name originally was Abram, which means great father, and then later became Abraham, which means father of many. And it's sort of ironic that his name means father because, in fact, he didn't have any children. He was getting older in life without any children. In fact, he didn't have a child, at least not the promised child, until he was 100 years old. And so the great father wasn't really much of a father. And this is the main conflict in his life. He's waiting. God has promised him that he will give him descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, that they will possess this land, that he will bless many nations, that God will work through him and his line, and yet he has no line yet. It is the conflict of his life. And so there's a lot of stories about Abraham. We touched on a lot of them this week in your small groups. We find out about Abraham meeting a guy named Melchizedek, who was a high priest. We find out about Abraham lying to people about his wife. Did you catch that part of the story? He was afraid that the people would kill him because his wife was so attractive. Same feelings I have toward Jen. And that he lied and said that she was his sister to save his own skin. And he did it not once but twice. Abraham, not the perfect person. Later we find out that he and his wife Sarah were unsure about God's timing, and they decided to help God out. And since Abraham didn't have a child, he got with his concubine Hagar and had a child by her. And that child was named Ishmael. But Ishmael was not the child of promise. In fact, Ishmael, it is said, would grow into his line into the Arab nation, which would be basically the Muslims today and things like that. And there was conflict even going that far back. We have here Abraham going through these stories. He rescues his nephew Lot. He defeats a bunch of kings. We have all of these stories of Abraham. But the gist of his life, the final moment, the big piece, comes when Abraham is tested. And God tests him in a really strange way. See, Abraham finally had the son Isaac when he was 100 years old. And when he found out that he was going to have a child, he and his wife Sarah laughed because they were so much further along. And so God said, name your son Isaac, which means laughter. Finally, he has the son of promise, the one God had said he would give him, the one through whom all of his descendants would be blessed. And God says, Abraham, take your one and only son. I want you to take him up, and I want you to sacrifice him. And by sacrifice, I mean slaughter. Now, by the way, let me be clear. There is no place in the Bible where God seriously recommends a child sacrifice. Although that was sometimes present in the religions of the ancient Near East at the time, we don't find that in the Bible. God doesn't seem to approve of such things. So this is not by any means permission that those who think they hear God can commit outrageous acts of violence. That's not what it's about at all. What it is about is whether Abraham has the faith to be obedient that God can put his claim upon one man, the first follower, the first ingredient in what he was making. And so we find out that Abraham had a certain amount of faith and decided he had to do what God suggested, even though this was the promised son. And he takes them to the mountain, leaves his servants behind. There's a great little part of the story where Isaac, as a young boy, is carrying the wood for the sacrifice. He looks at his father, and in one of those small little child voices, he says, Father, the wood is here, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Which is particularly poignant in the moment because we know, as the readers of the story, that the sacrifice is Isaac himself. And Abraham says God will provide it. And so he takes him up and he binds him to the altar and he gets ready to sacrifice his one and only son. He raises the knife up in the air, and as you probably know, God stops him. An angel says, "Stop, Abraham. Now I know that you are truly committed. Now I know that you are mine." The first ingredient was faith. A man who truly lived by faith. The first brick of God's temple being laid. The first person of the nation that he would create. Let me actually read the part of the story. I think I've got a slide for that. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." See, this is all about God's claim upon one man. God knows that Abraham is fully his now, because Abraham has not withheld anything. This was the test. God knows that he has one person for sure. By the way, earlier you mentioned the significance of the hill of Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac. And it tells us later in the Bible that this was the hill upon which Jerusalem would later be built. Now, because I'm an obsessive Bible college student, I have to mention one thing. Jesus was not crucified within the city limits of Jerusalem, right? Because of the dead body issue. He was crucified outside the city. So if the city is on the hill of Mount Moriah, Jesus was just outside of that. So maybe not exactly the same hill, but pretty close. Forgive me for being a little bit liberal. This is the way my mind works. But yes, Jesus, the sacrifice that was reflected there in Abraham and Isaac, is reflected later in Jesus, God giving his one and only son. No doubt about it. Okay, so we move on with the story. And there are more patriarchs. By the way, if you are a Bible student, you need to know when someone talks about the patriarchs, who does that refer to? Well, it refers to basically three guys, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So if you hear patriarchs, think Abraham, Isaac, Jacob in that order. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob had 12 sons. Okay, so think about it in that order. These are the patriarchs. Now, as we get to Isaac, the next part, we find there's actually not as much information about Isaac as there is about Abraham and also Jacob. So Isaac's section is relatively short. We have him as a young child almost being sacrificed, and we have him as an old man being deceived by his son Jacob. But in the middle, there's only a couple of stories. There's a story about how he meets his wife Rebecca, and then there's another story where he does the same thing his father did and lies about his wife being his sister. An interesting parallel. But to really follow the story, we've got to move past Isaac and get to Isaac's son, Jacob. Now, Isaac had two sons, actually. They were twin boys by the names of Jacob and Esau. And Jacob and Esau were twins, and as they came out, Esau came out first. And they grew up to be very different people. Esau was like me. He was big and burly and an outdoorsman. It's okay to laugh. I'm making a joke. Jacob was more of the inside kind of guy. He liked to hang out at home and take care of things there. Esau was his father's favorite. Jacob was his mother's favorite. And they had sort of this different chemistry and different personalities, as siblings sometimes do. And so you have them raising, and eventually there's this conflict between Jacob and Esau. They're not getting along because Jacob is kind of a trickster. He's kind of manipulative. And so one day Esau comes in from the field, and he's very hungry, and he's looking for something to eat, and Jacob just happens to have some stew there. And he says, please give me some of your stew. And Jacob decides he has an opportunity and says, well, if you want it, you'll have to give up your birthright. And the birthright back then was a big deal because it was the right as the firstborn son, which Esau had at the time. It would provide him twice as much of the inheritance and the blessing of carrying down the line. And Esau gives it up for a little bit of stew. Not even like Taco Bell, just stew. And so that's the first thing that happens between Jacob and Esau. Esau doesn't value it enough. He gives it up too easily. Later, there's an interesting story where we find out that Isaac is now old and blind, almost blind. And he's getting sickly. And he's decided it's time for him to give his blessings to his sons. And blessings back then were really an important part of their culture, because it was basically a prophecy. It spoke their destiny into being. And so he's there to bless his son Esau. And he tells Esau to go out and find him some food to hunt and bring him something back. But while he's out, Jacob decides to be manipulative and a trickster, and he comes back and he makes the food and he pretends to be his brother to his blind father. And it's actually kind of a funny story because Jacob is now convinced because the voice sounds different, or Isaac is not. And Jacob says, yes, this is your son Esau, and feel my skin. And Jacob has put furs, animal furs, over his skin so that he feels hairy like his brother Esau. And when Isaac smells the clothes, he knows it is Esau, but it's not. It's really Jacob. And Jacob steals the blessing. Now we've got a problem because now Jacob has stolen two things from his brother. One was the birthright, the second was the blessing, and that was unacceptable. We know now that Esau is mad, and Esau wants to kill his brother. And so Jacob decides to flee and run away to a different place. And he ends up at his uncle Laban's. In Laban, there's this period in which he lives there with his uncle. And he works for him in the fields. And he decides that he wants to marry a girl named Rachel. A beautiful woman who was Laban's daughter. He wanted to marry her, so he agreed to work 7 years for her. But we find out Laban may be an even better trickster than Jacob is. Because Laban, on the night of the wedding, sneaks in not Rachel, but his older daughter, Leah. And so he marries Leah, and then has to work another 7 years for Rachel. The trickster got tricked. Now we have these stories about Jacob there. He gets rich, he gets wealthy, God blesses everything that he has. He gets more cattle and goats and all of these things. He's doing very, very well. And he gets to the big point of his story when he decides to leave. He can't stay with Laban anymore. So he packs up his things, his belongings, his servants, his animals, and he goes away. But the dangerous part is that he knows he has to face his brother. So he's going home and his brother's going to be there. And he knows he's angered his brother and his brother wants to kill him. And so he's scared, he's afraid, he's wondering what's going to happen. He's very worried about it. And so as he's going along, he sends his servants ahead to look and see for his brother. And his servants do that and they come back and he says, what did you find? He said, well, we found your brother and he's on his way. Oh, really? What else? Well, he's coming with 400 men. This doesn't sound good. He's coming with a small army. This sounds bad. Jacob is going to be in a fight for his life, and he's worried and he's scared. He's at the tipping point of his life. Which way is he going to go? And so he makes all these preparations. He divides his camp into two, so that if one is attacked, the other might survive. He sends gifts ahead to try and placate his brother. Here are all these things. Let me give them to you. Show you how much I care. Welcome my coming home. And then he sits down And he does something he really hasn't done prior to this point. He prays. He must be desperate. So Jacob says a prayer. And I want to read that for you real quick. So I want you to listen to the sudden humility in Jacob's life. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers and their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. Jacob has a moment of humility when he prays to God. And here's this man who, in the very next chapter, or actually later that chapter, will wrestle with an angel of the Lord all night. And I'm not going to tell that story again because, if you remember, I preached that sermon not so long ago. The point is that Jacob has come to a key point in his life. He's decided to pray. He's wrestled with God. And he finally submits. He acknowledges what God has done for him. And all of a sudden, God's jurisdiction, if you will, which began with the one man Abraham, has now extended to Isaac and is now extended to Jacob. God is claiming one person after another in the process of building his nation. And yes, I know that God's jurisdiction has always been the whole world because he made it. But as far as those who were his followers, those he could claim, those he knew were committed to him, it started with one man. It started from scratch. Continued through Isaac and continued through Jacob. And Jacob will have 12 sons. And those 12 sons will become the tribes of Israel. And they'll go to Egypt and they'll grow into a large people group. And they'll come out of Egypt and get their own land. Then David will come and there'll be a whole nation. And so God's jurisdiction grows from this one man, Abraham, to a people group, to a nation. One after another, God's jurisdiction is expanding like the rings when you drop a rock into a pond. God's jurisdiction is growing. He's claiming one person after another. He started from scratch, and he's building something great. The first ingredient, I said, was faith, because Abraham was a person of faith. But the next ingredient is submission, because Jacob finally submitted to the God of the universe. But what God began with Abraham, claiming one person for himself, he will one day claim on the cross. Because when Jesus was on the cross and he died, and the curtain between mankind and the Holy of Holies was torn in two, because there was no longer any need for sacrifice, God bridged the gap and claimed the whole world to himself. And his jurisdiction expanded from one nation, just being the God of the Israelites, to being the God of the world. And so what God began, starting from scratch, grew into something huge and giant. This is the big picture of the story. God expanding his reign, claiming more and more people for himself. God is chasing people, seeking to be with us. He started with one man, continued it through a nation, claimed all people on the cross. Today, maybe, just maybe, God wants to claim you. Maybe you've been running away like Jacob. Maybe you haven't been counting on the promise of God like Abraham. I don't know what your situation is, but I do know that God wants to expand his jurisdiction today. He wants to claim one more person for his kingdom. And the first ingredient is faith, like Abraham. And the second ingredient is submission, like Jacob. And the third ingredient is the blood of Jesus Christ. And today, when we have our invitation time, I want you to consider coming to be a part of what God is doing. I want you to consider being baptized or joining the church or just coming up here to pray over something in your life that you need to give up. Because God wants to claim you too. And not only that, but today, God's jurisdiction expands to the church. And today, God is claiming our church. He's claiming Thayer Christian Church as his very own. It is his from now on. And he wants to use us. He wants to bless us. And he's doing great things. Our building is full again. But God is claiming us for himself. His jurisdiction is expanding. He started from scratch and is continuing to us. God's love is that great. Faith, submission,